Hello and welcome to another episode of Brave UX. I'm Brendan Jarvis, managing founder of The Space in Between, and it's my job to help you to put the pieces of the product puzzle together. I do that by interviewing world-class experts in user research and product management, and they share with us their expert learnings, stories, and advice. My guest today is Luke Hay. Luke is a consultant, trainer, speaker, and author from the seaside town of Brighton in the UK, where he has been making digital experiences better since the late 90s. Originally working in website optimization and marketing, Luke developed a keen appreciation for measurement, metrics, and results. In 2011, he made the move into UX design and user research. He currently invests his time between his role as user research director of Fresh Egg and his consulting and training practice. A self-confessed analytics geek, Luke published his first book in 2017 titled Researching UX Analytics, a deep dive into working with quantitative data to improve the user experience. He has also been published in UX Collective and SitePoint on Medium. As an active relaxer, Luke has also generously given his time to UX Brighton and UX Camp Brighton, an annual one-day unconference, for the past 8 years as a co-organizer. He has been described as a first-class trainer and an extremely knowledgeable person on the subject of using analytics to inform UX design decisions. Luke's mission is to help UXers to make significant and measurable impacts through their work, and it's great to be able to welcome him to the show today. Luke, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Brendan.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, and I've been looking forward to this conversation all week. I think the blending of the worlds of analytics and UX, while they are things that sometimes spoken about, they're often subjects that probably gets little less attention than it deserves. So I'm really excited to have you tell us a little bit more about that today. But before we get into some of the details around that, I was doing a bit of research preparing for today's conversation, and I saw, looking back through your LinkedIn profile, that it seems that you're largely self-taught, and you got into the industry in a technical admin role straight after high school. What was it that made you dive straight into this industry?
Good question. I wish I had a really clever answer for that one, but it was luck, to be honest. So I'd finished high school. I felt that I sort of had enough school for a while. I'd been doing it for a few years and didn't want to jump straight into university. So I originally planned to have a bit of a year out, but I hadn't really planned what to do on that year out. Got to a point where I needed some money, so I was just looking for jobs, and finally I saw an advert in the local paper. This is how long ago it was. That's where people look for jobs. And it was for a web company, and I sort of vaguely knew what a web company was, but this was back in '98. I didn't have the internet in my home at that point. Not that many people did, so it was a real sort of eye-opener to sort of say, I'd worked with computers a bit at school, but I'd moved on from that, and yeah, just went in for an interview and got the job at a very, very junior level. It was more a sort of office junior, really, but at this web company. And then, it sort of went from there, really, learning a lot, because the company grew from about, I think it was about 7 of us maybe when I joined, to probably around sort of 20, 25 by the end. So a bit of growth over a couple of years. And yeah, obviously the industry changed massively during that time as well.
So you've moved out of that web management, digital marketing focus into UX and research in particular about 9 years ago. What was it that again made you sort of make a shift from what you were doing into what you are doing now?
Yeah, I think it's probably a more gradual shift than it would appear on my LinkedIn or on my CV. But I think it was really the case of just over time working in primarily roles that touched on a lot of areas. They had one job title, but actually covered a range of different roles anyway. So there were sort of bits and pieces of dipping my toes into user research. But as I think everyone really who works in this particular industry, the passion came from really wanting to understand how people interacted with websites, think about the people behind them. I'm definitely not a developer at all. I'm, not artistic enough to be a designer. So it's sort of what do you do in between that? And there's the sort of two sides to it. Obviously, the more qualitative side, the sort of things that UXers will perhaps be more familiar with, which I'm very interested and spent a lot of time doing, but also obviously marrying that with the more analytical side, which I was doing from that first job that we spoke about. They were very basic analytics back then, but that was a part of my job to sort of see how many hits a website has had a month. That was pretty much the extent of it back then, but that was where it started on the analytics side.
Yeah, and people used to have those little hit counters on their homepage, right? Yeah,
exactly, that kind of thing. Just slightly more sophisticated than that back then. Yeah.
I think it's interesting talking to people with various different backgrounds, and just how a lot of the times there's a lot of value that people bring from their various experiences in other aspects of this broader digital field that we work in. And it's interesting to see how that influences where they end up going with it, particularly with their UX and research practices. Just before we get into a deep dive into UX and research and analytics and all of those good things, I wanted to spend a little bit of time just understanding a little bit more about your involvement with UX Brighton and UX Camp Brighton, because that's something that you've been doing for quite some time, and it appears to be something that you value quite a lot. Can you tell us a little bit about what those two things are and what it is that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the general interest in the sort of digital community here in Brighton came about because I used to work for a company called Wired Sussex, who are a membership organisation for basically web agencies in and around Brighton, and we used to have sort of a jobs board on the website and essentially help them develop their businesses there. So I was very much sort of in the centre of everything that was going on in terms of digital then anyway. So then when I sort of moved more into UX, it made sense to, and I have contacts in those sort of areas. So a guy called Danny Hope, who runs UX Brighton, I've known him for a long time, and so we worked together on aspects. I've run workshops for UX Brighton, both run them myself and also sort of managed and facilitated those for other people, as well as sort of helping out a bit with their conferences, of sort of organising volunteers and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's really my involvement with UX Brighton. UX Camp Brighton, again founded by a friend of mine, Patrick Sampson, and he essentially needed help to build the event from what it was. I mean, it's a really interesting event, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with the way unconferences work.
Somewhat, but yeah, some of our viewers might not be, so give us a little rundown.
Yeah, so it's an unconference, and basically the difference between a conference and an unconference is in a conference you have your speakers all organised and lined up, whereas in an unconference the attendees actually give the talks or run the sessions. So what you have at the start of the day is everyone who comes along gets a little card, and they write their name on the card and what they want to talk about, and that can be a sort of presentation, it can be an open discussion, can be some sort of workshop, and then all of these cards get put on a grid. So there's a grid of times during the day and multiple rooms normally too, and then at each session you have sort of 5 or 6 different rooms with 5 or 6 different talks being given by the attendees, and obviously the other attendees go along to those. And it took a lot of persuading actually for Patrick to get me to come along to the first event, because I was really nervous about presenting, which is a bit sort of funny looking back, but at the time I was really nervous, even though it was a very sort of small, friendly environment. It was still a bit unsure. I'd still rather have just gone along to watch, but he talked me into that, and then gave a small presentation there, and then the next year he needed a hand kind of putting everything together. So myself and some of the other volunteers, got together, sort of worked on organising the event, which takes a little bit of organising, and then it went from there really.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that you were nervous and you kind of got dragged along, and someone sort of encouraged you to sort of step into the spotlight and do that. And that's something that, obviously I find myself running this interview series. I mean, I think just in the intro there, I got a little bit tongue tied, and, even though that this is pre-recorded and it's pretty low pressure, you do feel that anxiety. What would you say to people in the UX community that have been considering contributing in the way that you have been, and getting up there, putting themselves out there and sharing their perspectives? Do you have any sort of words of wisdom to them or encouragement that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, the way it's worked, and I don't really speak from my point of view, because obviously everyone's very different. There are people who are more sort of extrovert who absolutely love doing these things. But for me, it was always just sort of starting small, kind of almost forcing yourself to do it, but starting in a friendly environment. So say UX Camp Brighton, for anyone who's perhaps a bit more local than you, definitely worth looking into when, when we're out of lockdown. It's well worth people coming along to, but it's a very friendly, supportive environment. We have sort of our session rooms, some of the smaller ones, you can maybe only fit about sort of 15 people in anyway, so you're not having to give a talk to a huge audience. So I think that definitely helps. And then really once you've done one or two of those kind of things, then everything else just gets a little bit easier, and you sort of, ideally, if you can step up a bit, speak at a small conference and then a bigger conference and that kind of thing. And, for me, I still get nervous. I spoke at Brighton SEO last year, and that was, I think it was sort of about 800-900 people in the room. And, for me, that's quite a lot. So, yeah, still get nervous about those things. But I think starting small, growing with that. But the other thing is just practice, really. I read somewhere, and I can't remember the exact details, but there was someone recommending you should practice something in full 7 times before you actually do it. So unfortunately, I can't remember the exact kind of theory or study behind that, but I try and do that. So I'll literally sit with my laptop in my kitchen or whatever and just kind of run through it till I know it, more or less off by heart, so more like a script. And then when you actually get there, you can then hopefully just sort of come back to you rather than trying to grasp around for things.
Yeah, so everyone that's listening, this is take number 5 of this interview, so we've got a couple more to go, Luke and I. I think it's important for people who are listening and wanting to perhaps contribute more to the community. I mean, globally, we're quite an approachable bunch. I think everybody's really supportive, and I think it's really important for people to realise that their harshest critic, or the thing that often stops them the most, actually lives between their 2 ears, your 2 ears. So you just get out there and do contribute and put yourself out there. You mentioned SEO. Now that's a topic I think is a good segue for us to move into this conversation around analytics and UX. And while SEO isn't necessarily analytics, you've described UX as SEO's best friend in the past. What was it that you meant by that?
Well, so technically I guess that wasn't me describing it in that way, although that was the talk I was doing, but I was doing that with an SEO friend of mine. So it's funny, I have a sort of jokey relationship with SEOs, in as much that I pretend I don't value what they do and that I find their work very boring, but actually it is a very necessary thing. It is important, for us as UXers, it's important that people are able to get to our websites. So although I don't want to be involved with SEO at all, it is important that those things happen. And I think over the past few years, I mean, probably several years now, Google's algorithm has really been based around trying to reward good user experience. So in the old days, you used to kind of cram loads of text on the page, loads of keywords, loads of links, that kind of thing. Whereas Google obviously saw people doing that, and now they're trying to make an algorithm that will effectively reward you for having well-written text and well laid out pages and that kind of thing, the kind of things that obviously we look for as UXers. And I think that was the point of the talk, really, which was the one I gave at Brighton SEO with my friend Mish, and she came at it from an SEO's point of view as to why they needed to spend more time talking to UXers, and then I was there effectively giving the job of sort of selling UX to, say, 800 or so SEOs who were perhaps as sceptical about UX as I was about SEO. But as I say, the point is Google's algorithm is based around UX, so I think for SEOs they need to be looking at that side of things. And certainly Fresh Egg, the background of the agency is primarily was in SEO originally. So from my point of view, it's really good to work with the guys there, and actually they're really forward thinking, and they're all up for sort of doing usability testing and even sort of testing the search results pages and seeing people's reactions to those. So I think there is definitely more of a crossover over time, where it's not just about chucking loads of keywords on a page, it's actually about thinking of the end user and understanding what they make of the experience.
So look, in 2017, you published a book called Researching UX Analytics, and no one, in my experience, writes a book just for fun. What was it that made you write this book, and who is it for?
So I hadn't really intended to write a book. I think, perhaps like a lot of people, it was something very, very far in the back of my mind that one day it might be a nice thing to do, but I had no intention of doing it at all. But SitePoint got in touch with me, who are the publishers, and I think again just because I'd had experience with analytics and UX, and written some blog posts, done a few talks, that kind of thing. I guess they found me through that and got in touch and said, we're writing a series of books because it's the sort of research and UX series. There are various other books in that series too. And they wanted one on analytics, and they came to me, said, did I want to do it? Told me that I wasn't going to get rich writing a book. And they were right.
Were they right?
Yeah, exactly. It was, but they were very upfront about it, and said it wasn't going to be a huge source of income, but it paid enough to make it worth my while to spend the time, because it does take a lot of time to write it. And I think from my point of view, it was one of those where I was a bit unsure, sort of, do you want to do this or not? It's going to be a load of effort. It's probably going to be a nightmare, but at the end of it, you'll have a book. So I went down that route. I thought, it's not like this opportunity is going to come up every day. Because as I mentioned before, with my freelance work, I do have effectively a spare day a week. So I could kind of sacrifice that to some extent and spend that writing. And yeah, it was actually not quite as bad as I thought it would be in terms of the effort involved. There was a lot of effort, a lot of back and forth, but ultimately it wasn't too bad. I think with the writing, you got to a point, I got some tips from other people who'd written books. I think that the best one was to kind of focus on word count as a way of getting toward the end. So not, the word count for the book overall wasn't that important, but they had a rough guideline of how many words it should roughly be. Yeah. So I knew that if I could do, and the magic number I think was 2,000 words a day. So I knew if I could get 2,000 words down a day that I was happy with, then that was good progress, and that I was definitely moving towards that finish point. So I think that helped to have an end goal in mind, because I'm a runner as well, so, yeah, right, hobby. So I do a fair bit of running, and that for me is always, when I set off on my runs, it's always like, how far am I going, sort of counting down towards the end to some extent. It was a very similar sort of process with the book of actually, putting a lot of time and effort into it, but ultimately if I could close the laptop at the end of the day and think I'd done, say, 2,000 or so words, then I thought that was fairly good, and I was one step closer to finishing, really.
Yeah, 2,000 words sounds like a solid effort. Tell me, who is it really written for? What audience are you trying to reach with this book?
So I think it's really anyone who works in UX who doesn't know a huge amount about analytics. I mean, it is a bit of a beginner's good book in terms of it presumes no prior knowledge of analytics. But I think in my experience, you have analysts who really like data, but maybe don't like people so much. And you have UXers who sort of like spending time with people. They like user interviews, all of that kind of thing, but really don't want to spend time looking at the numbers. And I think for me, hopefully, what the book does is it is very different to sort of how to use analytics side of things, or all the sort of tutorials for Google Analytics, because it's not really focusing on how do you find these numbers and how do you find these numbers and statistics and that kind of thing. It's all about really how all those numbers can be translated into something that's useful for us as UXers. So I think the main premise is really to take an analytics first approach to your work. So I'm in no way, and I really want to stress this, no way saying that people should just look at their analytics and then make assumptions based on that. But they are often a good start.
Leave a comment if you agree or disagree. Is that what you're saying? We'll have a good, robust discussion in the comment section.
Yeah, I'm hoping and assuming that no UX is going to come on here and say, "Oh, you don't need to, do any proper research. You can just look at the numbers." I'm hoping that's the case, and that's certainly not the point the book's trying to make. But I think the point is that you can get a really good understanding about what's currently going on the website. Where people might be dropping off certain journeys. There's a chapter in the book about analytics for user research, so you can actually find out a lot about your users from that. So within Google Analytics, they've got kind of demographic reports that will give you a broad understanding of the kind of ages, genders, that kind of thing of people using your site, obviously countries they come from, all of those kind of things. And that, as I say, it's the starting point, because everything else on top of that then is the fun stuff. So if you know that, say, there's older people are dropping out at this particular point of your journey, well, then you can go and get to do what we all kind of want to be doing, really, which is research into why that's happening, you know, perhaps doing some usability testing with older users or whatever that might be there. So yeah, it's using analytics as that starting point, but also looping it back in on the other end of actually measuring the results of our work, because I think that's something that UXers struggle with generally, of how do you actually prove and show the value of your work. And it's not always as easy as just looking at the numbers, but certainly that is one form of measurement that you can perhaps add.
I think we may have scared a few people with that. You mean we actually have to check that what we're doing is working? Far out, that's a radical idea.
We can always prove that one way or another, right? Whether it's more qualitative or more quantitative. But yeah, definitely good to have that option.
So you gave a couple of examples there of ways in which analytics can be used. You know, what are some of the most common problems that you see UXers encountering, and that having a better grasp of analytics can help them to solve? Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, say that the first thing is kind of that shortcut, getting started with something. That if you're, you know, if I said to you tomorrow, I got in touch with you and said, I want you to improve my website, you wouldn't really know much about that site and who's using it. You know, I could perhaps give you some anecdotal information, that kind of thing, but you know, within half an hour or so of looking through the analytics, you can find out, you know, how many people visit it, which pages are most popular, what the conversion rate is, what countries they come from. There's a whole bunch of information that really get you started. So that's why it's a great starting point there. It's also good for checking and validating assumptions to some extent. So if, for example, you've got a 5-step form and you just have a look at that form without looking at the analytics, and you think, oh, this third step seems really clunky to me, I'm not sure whether that's going to be working for users, then, you know, you can look at the analytics, and if there's a big drop off at that point, then that's just kind of backing up further what you're thinking. So again, you know, for me, it just should work alongside more qualitative methods.
Yeah. So the two working together to be able to really deeply understand, you know, what is going wrong and why that might be happening.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, that is the thing that people put out all the time, and it's entirely true. You know, although it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Essentially, the analytics do tell you what's happening, and the more qualitative forms of research will hopefully be able to tell you why that's happening.
Yeah. So you mentioned, and we were stereotyping earlier about how, you know, some UXers might not be that comfortable with the numbers, and the book was really written to help them to become more comfortable with that and using that in their practice. In your experience and conversations that you've had with other UXers, what are some of the fears or objections that people have around integrating analytics more into their practice and their research?
Yeah, I think I suppose the couple that spring to mind first of all are the fact that for lots of people, and I include myself here, I'm not a very sort of numerical person. You know, I didn't do very well at my maths exams at school and that kind of thing. So that's not really where I'm coming at it from. But I think people do have, I don't know about a fear of numbers, but, you know, they don't feel comfortable working with data in that way, which, you know, again, for sort of slightly less technical people, that shouldn't be a barrier, because, you know, say if I can do it, other people can. You know, the whole point about these kind of tools, particularly sophisticated tools like Google Analytics, is you don't need to do any of the maths yourself. Effectively, you know, you're not really there to sort of work out complicated statistics and things. It's more just looking at what's in the tool and getting what you want from the tool. And I think that's part of the problem, that a lot of people come to the analytics, and if you come at it without a view of what you want to do or without that idea in mind, then it is just a wall of numbers. You know, you're just kind of looking around blankly. It's just, you know, hundreds of different reports, and it's just confusing. So I think, you know, if people come at it more with a goal in mind of, I want to find out this particular part of the journey, or I want to find out, you know, which the most popular pages are, or whatever it might be, if you've got a bit of a goal in mind, it then becomes easier to interpret the numbers. So I think that's definitely one thing that puts people off. And also just kind of getting into the tool itself, whether it's Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics or Heap or any of the other tools that are out there, because people don't particularly like using them necessarily. It means they are quite complicated to use. They're the kind of tools that you do need to be using quite regularly. Otherwise, you forget where things are and you forget how things work. So that can be a barrier in itself, that every time you open it up, you're showing all these different charts, all these different numbers, and it can be a bit overwhelming. So hopefully the book would help to demystify that somewhat.
Yeah, I think I remember you writing that there are something like 500 default report views in analytics. So it's, you know, it can be a bit overwhelming if you don't have a good start point. Or as you mentioned, I think a key thing you mentioned there, Luke, was having the right question before you delve into it. You know, you need to know what it is that you want out of it. Otherwise, you'll probably get lost in a sea of data. Now, we were speaking off air about A/B testing. Now, I understand that this is something that's part of your practice at work. Now, what can you explain? Like, how are you using A/B testing in your UX practice? You know, what sort of problems or things are you trying to learn through that?
Yeah, so I mean, when I started at Fresh Egg, my job role was a sort of conversion strategist. So basically, it was focusing purely on how to make websites convert better, which, you know, to some UX purists is probably quite a dirty way of looking at things, because I think, you know, we all like to think, oh, it's all just about having the best user experience. So of course it is. But, you know, realistically, if you're working in a commercial world, you do need to see some kind of results. And that really is what the sort of CRO side of things, the conversion rate optimization, is about. And that's really, yeah, testing all sorts of things. So it can be, you know, most notably, I suppose, sort of things towards the business end, so things around the checkout and changing things there, you know, whether it's the sort of classic cliche, just changing the color of the call to action button, or, you know, ideally something a bit more nuanced and complex than that. But essentially by changing the design, which, you know, as UXers, we suggest new designs pretty frequently, but this is actually testing it. So, I mean, to go back to the very basics, A/B testing is when people come to the website, you show half of them one design, half of them another design, and see which half convert better in this case. And as I say, the way that works with Fresh Egg is it's a little bit more involved than that. See, myself coming from more of a UX background, again, it's combining these different techniques. So we'll use the A/B testing to get the more quantitative, measurable results, but we'll also do qualitative testing alongside that. So we might do user testing to understand, yes, it might be converting better, but what does it make users feel? Is it causing them issues? You know, is it frustrating the people who aren't actually converting? Also, particularly for longer term conversions, I mean, we work with one of the sort of largest distance learning providers in the world, and a lot of their comprehension, a lot of their challenge is to make sure that people understand what their offering is and understand things like how much it costs compared to other providers, that sort of thing. So it's not the kind of site like an e-commerce site where people are going to come in and they're going to convert. It might be a 6-month process of them researching everything, giving it careful consideration. So the A/B testing there gives us part of the story, but we do really need to do that longer term research as well to properly understand the impact things are having.
Yeah, it's interesting, this area of A/B testing, multivariate, and data science. You know, I was having a conversation with Phil Gordon from Spotify last week, and he is in charge of data scientists as well as the UX researchers, and these worlds are definitely coming closer and closer together. And having spoken to a few other people also that have been touring, particularly the Valley, you know, the big tech startups and big tech businesses. Sometimes they're using exclusively quantitative techniques, testing techniques to refine the UX and the UI. And I suppose we can come to that maybe near the close of the show, but just this notion of where UX might go and what the role of qual and quantitative techniques might have. I think it's a topic for the next decade for us to really consider. Now, just before we move on to another conversation, you know, what are some of the common mistakes or things that people should bear in mind or try to avoid when they're delving into their analytics and using what they see to make decisions? Are there any things that you think people should know or be wary of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, you need to make sure that the data you're looking at is accurate. So it's very easy to set up Google Analytics incorrectly. It's easy to have your data skewed by whether it's bot traffic or who knows what else might be happening there. I mean, at the moment, with lots of people working from home, can you be sure that you're filtering your employees out from that, for example? So it may be that, if you employ a lot of people and they're on the site doing things, then, that could be skewing your data. So it's really considering, is your data kind of technically set up correctly? Is it technically sound? Is there anything externally that's going to be changing that and causing issues there? So I think that the first thing would be make sure the data's sound. The second thing is obviously to report in the sort of most sensible way. So again, as I mentioned before, it's about coming into your analytics with an idea of what you want to sort of find in mind, and then looking at that rather than just kind of grabbing at anything that you think looks interesting. But I think the main issue for me, if you're doing both of those steps, is the sort of bias in quantitative reporting. So as UXers, we're very familiar with bias in quantitative reporting. We're very aware that we shouldn't be leading users when we're talking to them. Shouldn't be asking them, why do you think this website's so great? Those kind of things. Need to be careful in our language and nuance there. But it's the same with numbers, because people make the mistake of saying, well, the numbers don't lie, but they really do. So one thing I do in my training is I split my course into two groups, and I get them to look at exactly the same data. So like say, in a couple of months time period in Google Analytics for a certain account, and I get one of them to be really pessimistic and one of them to be really optimistic, and then I get them to report back to me. So the idea is that one group will say, oh, well, this figure's down and this figure's looking bad, and actually we're getting less visits from this group. And then the other group will report back to me and say, oh, we've had a brilliant couple of months, this is up, that's down. Because, things like conversion rate, for example, it's a useful figure in itself, but if all of a sudden you're getting twice as many visitors to the website, then that's going to skew the conversion rate. So, yeah, there's a lot more to the numbers than it seems. You need all the context behind it. So people do bring their own bias in. I've seen it all the time. I see it, not at work from us, but potentially from some clients. They'll look at, they'll launch a new website, for example, and there'll be, all of these good things and all of these bad things, and they'll purely just look at these. So I think that's definitely something to avoid. And as with bias in the qualitative side of things, that's quite challenging, because the whole point really around a lot of bias is it is almost, it's a subconscious thing that you're doing. So I think you need to try and check yourself as much as possible. You need ideally someone else to give their input, so it's not just you looking at it. And you need to report consistently as well. So, if you're reporting one thing one month, then don't go and report on something else the next month, because those numbers look a bit better. So, yeah, it's about being consistent.
Yeah, it brings to mind that saying, lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Mm.
It sounds like what you're saying is that unintentionally or intentionally, people seem to have somewhat of a flexible interpretation of what the truth of the data might be.
Yes, oh, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing it definitely at the moment with the sort of current situation of things, of daily reporting of how many cases there are of coronavirus and that kind of thing. And depending on who you talk to, it's either a positive or a negative, depending on how you're looking at it. Obviously, the number of cases is often down to the number of tests that are being done as well. So, we're having a load more cases than we were in, say, February or March, but that's partly, at least, because we're doing a lot more testing. So you're not really comparing like for like there. And yeah, obviously politicians, goes without saying, are the worst for this kind of thing. So politicians will, they'll report on the one good figure, even if it's surrounded by bad figures.
So if someone's presenting data to you, what are some of the questions that you can ask yourself or ask them that would help you better understand whether what you're looking at is a fair enough reflection of reality, or where the bias might be in what is being presented?
I think definitely the first thing would be a considered comparison. So to give an example, we're just into December now. If I had an e-commerce site that sold kind of gifts, and I was comparing this December to, say, November, or even to further back, sort of October, September, then obviously you'd expect the figures to be massively up. It's not really a fair comparison because the seasonal trade means that, for my particular site, it's always going to be high in December. So if someone was showing me the stats of here's how we've gone versus November, I'd be asking them, well, actually, how do we do compared to last December or the December before even, so comparing that like for like. So that's, I think, quite an important one there. And also to some extent, it's about trying to work out if and why they might be being biased. Again, if it's someone reporting back to you who you've paid to do a job and they're trying to show you that it's been really successful, then you might want to be a little bit more suspicious and dig a bit more. And again, ask for certainly those comparisons, ask for benchmarking as well. So as much as possible, if you can compare your conversion rate to other similar websites, conversion rates as an example, then that's worth doing. And just making sure you're getting all the numbers. So again, they might be telling you about your conversion rate, but actually you need to look at obviously things like revenue and average revenue per visitor, those kind of things. So really getting the whole data rather than just those sort of little slices that they want you to see.
Yeah, it also sounds like there's an understanding that you need to have of the incentives that sit behind that other person and what it is, the story is that they're trying to tell you. Now, you mentioned, for example, if you've employed somebody or you've hired an agency, for example, to report on something, then considering, how they might not be incentivized to tell you bad news, and therefore you might need to ask some deeper questions of what it is that you're seeing. I think that's an interesting point that you've made there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to mention that as well is about looking beyond things that necessarily the analytics themselves can show. So, for example, if I massively improve the conversion rate of a website by make it a load easier to buy things and had all sorts of offers where people could get things cheaper or anything like that, obviously you're reducing prices, there's going to be a hit on revenue, but also things like returns are a big thing at the moment, particularly as a lot more people are ordering things online, they're getting things delivered. Quite often you need to spend a fair bit of money to get free delivery, which is great. It looks like people are spending lots of money, but then if they're sending half the clothes back because your website doesn't do a very good job of describing them in detail or showing the sizing or the colorings off or whatever it might be, then that's not going to be any good to you as a business. So you need to be thinking more than just kind of what's happening there, it's what's happening longer term too.
Are there scenarios sometimes where the truth is just too dangerous for people to report on?
Good question. I don't know if there is. I think, again, as long as there's reasons for that, I think that's the key thing. I think if I had to deliver bad news, there was something that happened in terms of, the numbers are down for whatever reason, then I suppose the best thing you can do is not lie about that, because ultimately it's almost certainly going to get found out anyway. But it's more about actually doing the work to find out why that's happened. If I came to you and said your conversion rate's down and that was it, then you're not going to be too happy. But if I say it's down and I give some valid reasons for it and I give some next steps and some actions, even if we don't necessarily know the answer, even if it's a case of saying, well, it's down, it appears to be down on mobile, for example. So what we're going to do is we're going to do some usability testing on mobile. We're going to check that. We're going to, make sure we're running through things and finding a solution. So I don't think there's ever really an excuse for, lying about the stats or hiding the stats. But I think it's always good to, if there is bad news, have at least a plan of action of what you're going to do to improve it.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point as well. I mean, our superpower is basically the ability to find out why things are problems. And what you're saying is that the data, even if it's not good data, is telling you that there is a problem, and coming with a plan as to how you might find out why the problem exists and how to solve it is really the thing that's going to make the most difference to the organization.
Yeah, and I think, it's about, without spinning things, it is about how you position things. So, it is potential. If you just launch something and everything's tanked, then that's a bit different. But if you're coming to a new client and you're seeing actually, the industry average for your conversion rate is this high and you're here, then that's bad news for you at the moment. But it does mean there's all this potential that actually, with a little bit of work, hopefully you can be up there and you can be making, quite a lot more money. So that's definitely one way to look at it. And we do, with the more qualitative side of things as well, we're doing usability testing and we're finding all these problems. That's good because we found the problems and then we can work towards fixing them, which is better than just being living in ignorance and having an underperforming website or app or whatever it might be.
100%. Now, since COVID descended upon us all earlier this year, it's reshaped the way a lot of us are running research, and a lot more studies are running remotely, particularly usability tests. How do you feel about the move towards more remote research?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that sort of a couple of years ago, we had a couple of big remote research projects, and they were quite challenging. The reason for doing those was because we were looking for people in both England and in Scotland in one case, which isn't a million miles away, but it's obviously a bit of travel involved for a few user tests. So we decided to run those remotely, and they work to a point, but there is definitely a challenge for doing the remote testing compared to being in the same room with someone. It's harder to build that rapport. It's harder to sort of get those non-verbal signals. You can sort of get a limited amount of that, but not quite the same. It's a little bit harder to put people at ease, and also there was, particularly at the time we were doing that, a few sort of technical problems. It doesn't take a huge amount. Someone, for example, just having a slightly bad Wi-Fi connection can really throw things out, because even though you can sort of see them, if they're slightly delayed, it makes things very stilted, very hard to actually have a natural conversation. So I think I was a bit sceptical about the remote side of things, but then obviously the current situation's occurred, and I think we've done about sort of 50 odd usability tests at Fresh Egg since it's happened, really, and all of those have obviously been remote, and they've all pretty much all of them worked really well. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think people are getting more used to using things like Zoom. Your average person is using Zoom to talk to their families, to talk to their friends, to do quizzes, all of these things. So from their point of view, they're much more comfortable not only using the technology, but also with the way the technology feels and the way people act on there. So I think that's really improved things and opened things up. It also means, from a practical point of view, people have kind of got it installed already, so it's a bit less of a sort of hoop to jump through there. And there are, of course, really big benefits to doing the remote side of things from an accessibility point of view. People who have trouble travelling, or if you're using a lab that's upstairs and that has accessibility problems for people, people who just don't like going out or travelling, all of those people, normally their voices wouldn't be heard in the kind of lab-based user testing that goes on. So that opens that up, and of course geographically as well. As we were talking before we started about kind of where there are usability labs, and most of the ones sort of local-ish to us are probably in London. So there was perhaps a bias towards London with some of our testing, whereas now really doesn't matter whether they're in London or Aberdeen or wherever it might be. So I think that's definitely helped. So there are some elements that are missing from doing it this way, but I think certainly it's become easier for people to take part. And also, as user researchers, I think we probably upskilled a bit just by having that experience, because I think when you start out, it takes a few usability tests to really get going with it. And I think it's the same with a change in the way they're facilitated. The remote side of things takes a slightly different skill set, and I think just purely by doing quite a lot of them, you learn more and get more comfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, with the, I suppose, accessibility that you mentioned, more and more people have Zoom and other platforms installed, and the actual access that it provides people that might be disabled to participate, the ability to get, I suppose, a more representative group of users because you're not restricted to geography. And this is a big question for me to be posing, because of course we at the Space in Between do have a lab. Is there any reason to return to moderated in-person testing?
Yeah, I think so. I think I my plan, depending on obviously how everything pans out, but my plan would definitely not be to completely stop doing that. I think there's so much more you can get. As I say, it's that bit easier to sort of build the rapport, but also from a physical point of view, particularly if you're trying to test across different devices, for example, that's a bit of a challenge at the moment, because you can get a user to join on the phone, you can get them to join on a laptop, but it's not that easy to kind of get them switching between the two if you want to test across both platforms. Also on the mobile side of things, even though Zoom is relatively user-friendly, it still can be quite challenging for people to share their screens on their phones, and with slightly different phone makes and models. Again, from our point of view as well, we're sort of saying, well, are you on an iPhone? Or it should say this and it should say that on an Android. So that's a little bit more complicated. So the technology, it's not the same as being able to lean over to someone and say, oh yeah, just do that thing there or whatever, or you can just set it up for them and let them go with it. So I think there's definitely the sort of device side of things from a more practical point of view. And so having that chat in person, particularly if it's sort of more user interviews, I think it is nice, and you can't replace that sort of human contact of being in the same room. The plan moving forward, as far as I'm concerned, would be to still use labs, but for the right projects, and use remote for other projects.
So one of the other things that you're really passionate about, Luke, is training, and you've got some fantastic reviews about about the training that you deliver. Now, obviously, you were delivering those in person, and now with COVID, that's become almost difficult. And I believe you're doing about 10 sessions a year, so almost one a month. How have you had to adapt your approach to training to this new environment?
Yeah, I mean, again, I said similar to the remote testing, really, in as much as you sort of have to think about things a bit differently. You have to consider various things, and then you have to just start doing it and kind of improve each time. So hopefully the first training session I gave in that way, and I still got fairly good feedback. So I don't think it wasn't a disaster, but I think you sort of hone it as you go. And I think there's different things. So it's definitely making sure people are involved a bit more, making things, I try and make things interactive in my training anyway, because no one likes just being sat there listening to people. But it's more about making sure, if nothing else, it's just for you to make sure they're still there, because particularly when you first start doing it, it's really unnerving. If you can't see anyone or hear anyone, you'll literally just feel like you're talking to yourself, and you always sort of think in the back of your mind, when I ask this next question, it might be that my internet connection went down 10 minutes ago and no one's been listening. So it's just good to get people even just saying that they're there, but more so to do interactive things. And I think that's where tools like Miro come into play, where you can actually do sort of virtual post-it notes and that kind of thing. Jamboard, various other tools, even just things like Google Docs in general, some spreadsheets and things for some of it. But whatever the tool is, just something to get people engaging with that is good. And I think making sure that you're open to questions and answers, realizing that some things will take more time and some things will take less time. That's the tricky bit. I mean, that's always been the tricky bit in a way with training, is getting the timing right. And doing things online, strangely, sometimes take longer, sometimes not as long. So that's a little bit of trial and error for that, I think. Yeah.
So turning our attention to usability testing again, I believe you've run tests with some quite colourful groups of society in your experience. What is the funniest thing that you've seen or observed when you've been running a usability test?
So I guess that the funniest one would be the guy who was in bed when he was doing the testing. So that was a mobile test for the Free University website. And I sort of, Zoom call again. This, I suppose I should say up front, this was a remote one. It wasn't an in-person one. I didn't.
Next time, okay, all right. Yeah.
It was. It was a remote thing. So I see, had him on the laptop, and so came up, answered the call, and then he just looked confused. It was like he'd just answered the phone and he wasn't expecting it. He was like, "Oh, hello," and then you just sort of see the bed behind him, and then it went a bit quiet for it, and you could kind of see him. I think he had the phone down. You could see him put his socks on and things. It was all a bit odd, that one.
So
But you know,
how did you handle that? I mean, because for people, researchers that, maybe new or haven't yet run many studies, they might not have encountered some of these weirder situations. As an experienced moderator in these cases, what are some of the stories that you tell yourself or techniques that you have to employ when stuff starts going sideways?
you just have to go with it, I think. I mean, it's always going to happen. The more of these kind of sessions you have, the more chance you're going to get, a few characters, as we like to call them, popping up here and there. But, in that case, it was just a sort of thing of saying, well, are you okay to do this now? Do you want to do it later? And it was fine to do it now. So you just kind of carry on and ignore it to some extent, and try and give them a bit of time to get everything together. But you just carry on through it. And actually, I mean, overall, the feedback was, as good and valid a session as it would have been normally. And arguably, we try and recreate a more natural environment in these ways. You might want to be looking at that website when he was in bed normally. So, yeah, why not?
It's a bad habit that we have, isn't it? Waking up and checking our phones and
exactly, yeah, exactly.
So common. Probably not that healthy, but quite common.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the other one that was more of a sort of challenge in its own way was an in-person one, and it was working with a website for sort of pregnant and recent mothers. And we had the genius idea of sort of getting people in to the office and actually using this site, which, to say, was aimed at effectively giving help and advice and support to people right from sort of looking to get pregnant to having more or less toddlers. So it was a bit of a range. And obviously all of them brought children with them, most of them, or some of them, multiple children. So that was quite chaotic, because obviously you had sort of mum doing the user testing on the phone with me sort of sat next to her with baby one arm, kid running around screaming in the background, that kind of thing. So it was a bit like, okay, yeah, this is intense.
Probably quite reflective of reality, right?
Exactly. So, that was the main thing. That was an intense afternoon, and perhaps put me off having kids. It was still, it was still a good environment in that way. It was more, it was the next best thing to going to visit them at home and seeing them using it there.
Yeah. Can I just ask, was it all males that were planning that study that were surprised by the outcome?
No, funny enough, it was a bit of a mix, and we weren't necessarily that surprised. I think it was just, I mean, we had planned, we'd sort of got sweets out and that kind of thing for the kids, but that obviously doesn't necessarily help.
I was saying that's why they were running crazy.
Yeah. So there's always one or two odd things like that going on, but again, just super interesting, and that's why we do the job, really, to have those kind of experiences. It beats going in to do a sort of very boring 9 to 5, looking at spreadsheets all day, when you can have things like that.
100%. And what role do non-design or non-UX stakeholders play in the testing that you've done? Do you ever have them observe what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, it's really key to get those people involved more. And I think we're in an easy position that it's quite an easy sell, UX, in terms of getting people involved. As I sort of mentioned before, at Fresh Egg, we have an SEO team, for example, and all of those. Sure, I always tell them they have really, really boring jobs, and what they do is, really dull. And I'm not sure they'd agree with that, but I think they definitely would agree that getting involved in the sort of usability testing side of things and user interviews and that kind of thing is a really nice bit of variety to their role, and is really key, of course, to what they're trying to achieve as well. So getting them involved either as observers, or hopefully a little bit more than that, actually actively inputting into the research one way or another, is really key, and particularly from our clients' perspective, because they don't really care whether it's a sort of SEO recommendation or UX recommendation. They just want a recommendation to help them with their challenge. So the more we can kind of come together and give them something that works from all aspects, the better. Because with the best one in the world, I can say from a UX perspective, do this and that, but actually if it's going to completely ruin someone's search ranking, it shouldn't, because that's what Google was looking for. But if doing that would actually have an adverse effect on their search ranking, then that's something that needs to be considered. So by working closer as a team, we can do that. And then from more of a sort of stakeholder client point of view, again, really good to get them involved. It's good for them to see things firsthand, because there's a massive difference between a user saying something and sounding frustrated with things. I mean, we've probably all put together like sort of little clips of users, shouting and swearing and ranting at their phones to show stakeholders, and we all know how effective those are. But also just between the sessions, so particularly for lab-based testing, we'd normally have perhaps the client sat in the observation room, and between each test we can kind of pop in and kind of say, what do you think about that? They can give us insight, and also particularly if it's a website or product that we're not experts on. Recently we were doing testing on a very sort of complex financial services pensions system, and it was quite a challenge for me as a data to actually say, you're looking to increase your EBC by 10% or whatever, and all of this sort of jargon that didn't mean much to me. So having the stakeholder client who I could go and ask and say, you're asking me to ask them this, but what does this actually mean? To actually have someone on site to help kind of me to make sense of it and be able to talk in the same language as the user as well. That was really useful.
Yeah, it's this notion, I suppose, of removing the abstraction that exists if you're just looking at the numbers. And if you have people together, you're able to have those conversations where you can observe something happening that's real and then interpret and see from that, what the underlying issue might be. I think this is a good point to come back to that. I suppose that notion of where UX might go that we spoke about briefly earlier in this conversation. And it seems that the conversations that I'm having, at least, that data and big data and data science is playing more and more of a role in UX. So thinking about the trends and the things that you've observed to date and how you see things, in the near future, maybe project that out. And what is it that you think UX and UX research will look like in 2030?
It's good question. I mean, I don't know that it will necessarily be that different. My thinking is that you can have, the best algorithms, you can have, the most sophisticated sort of multivariate testing, that kind of thing, but it's going to be really hard to properly replace the nuances of human behaviour. I don't know how a robot would cope with a user being in bed when they did their user testing. It's those kind of things that I don't think there's a replacement for. So although there'll definitely be elements of that, and as you said yourself, we're already seeing elements of that. There's definitely a more human side needed too, of course. And then I think there's the other thing about thinking longer term and to think about dark patterns and that kind of things. You can have an algorithm that really drives conversions up for a website, perhaps by doing all sorts of multivariate testing, but that doesn't mean it's a good experience. That doesn't mean that person's going to come back. It doesn't mean that person's not going to get annoyed after the purchase and leave a really terrible review, which over the long term, then we all know the importance of social proof. People are just going to stop using companies because they've got such a bad reputation. So it's those kind of things that are going to be really difficult or almost impossible for machines to understand, of how important the reputation of a company is and how what's happening on the website might be affecting that. So I think definitely we'll still need humans to understand humans effectively. Until robots can start selling to each other and that kind of thing, we get completely put out of the picture. I think, I can't see things changing massively. I mean, the only changes will be on a smaller level, as I mentioned before, like perhaps having more remote testing, that kind of thing. Definitely the field opening up in terms of there probably won't be such a thing, perhaps, as a user researcher. I think it will be more a sort of part of people's jobs. I think there will be people who perhaps specialise in it a bit more, but I think it will definitely be more evenly spread out, and other people working in the industry will perform that role too. So I think things will change slightly, but the core, the basis behind research, it's been the same for a long time, and it will probably be the same for a long time in terms of the methodology and how it all works.
And us to be able to bring that humanity and perhaps not a topic for today, but that ethical lens that we can look at the design decisions with. So tell me, are you up for playing a game?
Yes.
Yes, a bit of hesitation there. I promise it'll be painless.
Slightly hesitant, but let's give it a go.
So I play this game every interview. It's called What Comes to Mind. So when I say a word, which I'll say soon, a word will pop into your mind and you just tell me what that is. Mm-hmm. If you feel like explaining it, you can. I've had people swear. I've had people give long explanations of why they thought of things. It's totally fine. Whatever you feel like doing. Are you ready?
Yeah.
First word is bias.
So do you want a single word answer, or do you want a
single word? Feel free to explain whatever comes to mind.
I mean, I think it's a good one to start with. I mean, the first thing that popped into my head was cognitive, just because sort of cognitive bias, but that doesn't, that's just a thing. That doesn't really mean anything. I think the next thing would be, I suppose that it's a very interesting subject in as much that, a lot of there is unconscious bias, and I think that is for me, I'd say, if I had to say one word, I'd say interesting as a subject. Sort of bias and the psychology behind the side of things is something I definitely am interested in and would like to learn more about, really, as much as anything else.
Cool. The second word is analytics.
Necessary, I think. That's probably what I go for there. Yeah, not as interesting, but necessary, useful. Those kind of words spring to mind.
And our final word today is politics.
Depressing. I mean, so I'm, chatting. I'm in the UK, and at the moment, I think depressing probably sums it up quite nicely.
Well, let's not finish on a depressing note.
No.
Luke, what keeps you working in and contributing to so generously this field of UX and research?
I think a genuine interest in the side of things. We touched on a few points today that there's nothing that I enjoy more in the work context than going and doing these kind of user interviews and finding out more about people and their lives and how they do things and their thoughts on things. So that definitely from sort of actually doing the work side of things is what keeps you going, I think. Always good to actually make a difference. As I mentioned before, there's been some sort of tests that we've done that can be measured quantitatively, and particularly if it's been a long project with qual and quant and everything involved, and at the end of it you can actually say, we did all of this, we can see the users are happy and your sign-ups have gone up by this amount, so that's good. And I think finally that the people, really, you said yourself, you've spoken to a lot of kind of interesting people through this, people who work in UX generally, by and large, nice people. They're friendly people, they're interesting people, they've got a lot to say, and I think that's definitely something that on the sort of event side of things and organising conferences and things, that's what sort of keeps me doing that, really. So yeah, definitely made friends in the industry as well.
Yeah, there are some really great people. Thanks, Luke. It's been really great having you on the show, and today's conversation has been really valuable. Thanks for generously sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us. It's been so good to have you here.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
I'm sure what we covered today will be useful for people trying to create better experiences for users. What's the best way that anyone watching this can connect with you?
Yeah, so depending on what they're into in terms of their social network of choice, but my website is lukehay.co.uk, so you can find out a bit more about me there and get in touch directly from there. LinkedIn as Luke Hay, obviously, and I'm Hey Luke on Twitter. That's HayLuke. So yeah, follow me on Twitter if you want sort of bizarre rants about football and the occasional bit of UX thrown in there too.
What's your favourite football team?
Oh, Brighton, obviously.
Brighton. Love it.
Yeah.
Here we go. Hey, look, everyone who's tuned in, it's been great to have you here as well. Everything that we've covered today, Luke and I, will be in the show notes, including detailed chapters, so you can get quickly to the questions and the topics that we've covered. We'll also be linking through to all of the ways that you can contact Luke and keep in contact with him and see where his career takes him. If you've enjoyed the show, don't forget to like the video and leave us a comment. If you want to see more of these conversations, subscribe to the channel because they'll be coming out roughly every 2 weeks. And until next time, keep being brave, everyone.